Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to say sort of something quite similar to Tom, but in a much less amusing and enjoyable way. I want to defend independent regulators as a politician. And I want to explain why that's so important, because I think they are under attack. And I think they're under attack today. They may be under attack under the Labour government, but I see two populist trends in British politics. One is which is saying that elected politicians, although they're scoundrels, should be accountable for everything, and they're asked to be accountable for everything in the media and by the public. And a second trend that says regulators and regulations are ipso facto bad because they're interventions in otherwise perfect markets. And they are odd trends to have together, but they are there, and I think they are undermining the case for independent regulation that we've heard so eloquently. And I want to, in defending the case, give a few examples from my 5 years in government to illustrate four of the classic arguments for independent regulation. Namely, first, how independent regulation can be a shield from the dangers of political lobbying and short-term political pressure. Not always, as we heard, but it can be. How independent regulators doing their job well can actually raise investment by increasing uncertainty and therefore reduce costs to the consumers. How independent regulators can produce better outcomes by bringing together greater expertise and focus than would be available in a department and under ministers. And fourthly, how independent regulators can help improve public confidence and industry confidence, especially around controversial and difficult decisions. And my experience comes, as Anna was saying, not just from the energy space, where I worked very closely with Ofgem and the Office of Nuclear Regulation, but I also was responsible for merging the OFT with the Competition Commission. When I was Minister for Competition, I transferred POSCOM's responsibilities to Ofcom, in fact to Ed, when he was Chief Executive, as I piloted the Royal Mail privatisation through Parliament. And finally, I created a new regulator, the Oil and Gas Authority, which was taking regulatory powers out of ministerial hands into a new arm's-length regulator. So through these arguments at a canter, first, energy prices. Hugely controversial, still so, but possibly more so a few years ago. And I think Ofgem and the CMA saved us from a return to full-scale price regulation. And it's quite a fascinating story because it starts with an energy secretary who in office had always refused to intervene in the price debate, and he then becomes the leader of the opposition. He's in political trouble, and he reads the opinion polls, which told him, like it was telling me, that energy prices were a rising concern, and if he did something about it, he might gain some popularity. So he had a party conference speech to make, and the centrepiece became a call for an energy price freeze. Now, this was very effective politics. Got some great headlines. The coalition went into a total frenzy. Well, number 10 and number 11 did. The PM thought he was politically vulnerable. The Chancellor saw it as a chance to attack green crap, even though the green levies were empirically not the problem. And then we had 3 months of intense internal debate in the government, with one infamous moment that I'd like to remind you of. The moment when a Conservative Prime Minister from the dispatch box said there should be one price for energy. One price. Conservative. Unless you think that was a slip of the tongue at the dispatch box, Number 10's Downing Street's minions had been pressurising my office for days to consider that proposition. Ofgem came to the rescue. Perhaps more by fortune than planning, Ofgem was the next week due to release the conclusions of a 2-year-long retail market review. Now that recommended energy suppliers could only offer 4 core tariffs around which they could compete. Now, as it happened, I thought 4 core tariffs were too few. I got Ofgem's argument that intervention was needed to prevent the proliferation of tariffs confusing the consumer and thereby undermining competition. I just thought they'd gone too far. Number 10 didn't. And as they thrashed around to dig the Prime Minister out of the hole, they first wanted to use the Ofgem report to argue for 2 tariffs, then for 3. So I compromised and I accepted Ofgem's recommendation of 4 tariffs. Independent regulation is a fabulous cushion when the immediate political debate goes to the mob and our political leaders are weak. Independent regulation in the economic sphere is, of course, key for increasing investment and keeping costs down. I don't need to remind you that many investments in the utility space are long-term, needing high levels of capital up front. So for the private sector, the private investor, predictability of regulation is prized very, very highly and can make a huge difference in an investment risk profile, therefore the project cost, and therefore the price to the consumer. And for an Energy and Climate Change Secretary, this ought to be paramount. When I came to office in 2012, the UK needed tens of billions of new investment in our energy infrastructure over the following 10 to 15 years. Now, we were on track last May, but that still leaves a mountain to climb. But independent regulation is important here, even though there's lots of things changing in the system inevitably. And let me give you one clear example where we are benefiting from Ofgem's independent regulatory system, and that's how they regulate the electricity and gas networks, the local and national monopolies of distribution and transmission, the so-called RIIO system, revenue equals incentives plus innovation plus outputs. This Ofgem model, introduced before my time, is leading to billions being invested, attracting investment from around the world, with the network costs paid for by consumers on a long-term decline. Governments from around the world have been visiting the UK to find out how we've done it. Yet in the UK, it's one of our best kept secrets, and Ofgem doesn't talk about it. I think they should. Now, of course, there are a plethora of examples I could have used in this area of investment, including ones where regulatory uncertainty has damaged investment, has been a blight on investment. I would, of course, like to talk about examples where new governments, unencumbered by economic liberals, change energy policy so sharply that investment plummets and energy security is genuinely imperiled. But that's another story. Please invite me back. Let me skip on to the expertise benefits of independent regulation. And I want to pray and aid my decisions to wrap Postcom into Ofcom and to merge the OFT with the Competition Commission. But before I do, let me make a little political confession. There was a political drive in the coalition to reduce the headcount of quangos. So ministers were encouraged to combine quangos and regulators as quangos. I like to think, however, that I took my decisions based on the evidence, but that will be for you to judge. With Postcom, my fear was that it was just too small and had been too focused on detailed regulation of a public monopoly. I felt that in the new world we were creating of a more aggressive private Royal Mail, coupled with demanding new competitors, Postcom had to be reinforced, both by size and by experts more experienced with such battles. Plus, of course, regulating physical communication by letters separately from electronic looked outdated, and the interaction of the digital space with parcels looks compelling. But the key point for this decision, though, was this. At no time did we seriously contemplate any model other than independent regulation for postal services. Ofcom had the expertise, the department didn't. And therefore, I think, obviously, it was the right thing to do. When it comes to the competition authorities, merging OFT and the Competition Commission, I was really quite careful and cautious about this. I probably spent more time working on this with towels around my head than on any other decision I took in government, because there was a strong argument that we'd already had a well-functioning competition regime, and that actually regulatory change here of the system would chill investment and damage the economy. So I only proceeded, despite all the pressures coming from elsewhere, after being convinced that the combination of the reforms that we were making, both to the institutions and to the law, together would improve the regime. And one of the more compelling arguments was the bringing together of expertise combined with greater powers for the CMA. Especially the powers to enable, this may be controversial in this audience, that greater expertise of the CMA to be used with the various domestic economic regulators, who sometimes, I think, go for the regulatory toolbox more than quicker than going to the competition toolbox. And I wanted to go further in the law, but I was thwarted. But in creating more expertise at CMA, I also wanted it to be used in the international sphere, obviously the EU and beyond, and the Act has that in place. So in this CMA, I believe we've created a global leader in independent competition regulation with enhanced authority, thereby strengthening its legitimacy and role. And I was actually delighted that its first investigation was into the energy markets. There's a serendipity there. My final point to defend independent regulators relates to their ability to command public and industry confidence in a way which a minister and government department in some circumstances will never be able to do. And my example is the Office of Nuclear Regulation, though a similar argument can be made with respect to industry confidence about the Oil and Gas Authority that I established, taking regulatory powers from my department. Now, the ONR, fortunately, is not well known, but it has lots of clever people taking decisions on information ministers and officials wouldn't begin to understand, and with experience we could never have. The ONR are taking highly controversial decisions, licensing nuclear reactor designs, agreeing to life extension of aging nuclear reactors, and the like. But I'm not convinced the public want politicians in charge of those decisions. And I'm proud to have legislated to put the ONR on a statutory independent footing, whilst at the same time requiring them to be more publicly accountable and transparent so that their annual reports are published. And we had an interesting discussion about the publication of their first annual report, where they weren't very media savvy, and I'll leave it there. Now, no one reported about these changes to the regime of the nuclear regulator, but if there is to be a nuclear power renaissance in Britain, and I think the jury is still out on that, but if there is, then the public, I believe, needed these additional protections and reassurances from a statutory independent regulator. So let me conclude. I think the case for independent regulators is as strong as ever, and recent evidence and my experience support that. But, and here's an important but, regulators must not become so detached from public opinion that they take their decisions and make their statements as if they have a divine right to exist. This is sort of the mirror of what Tom was saying. I think it's completely consistent with what he said. Because an independent regulator's legitimacy will always be under the public spotlight. And my experience was sometimes not every individual regulator appreciated that enough. Sometimes independent regulators see ministers as the problem, and maybe they were sometimes, but they don't seem to recognise sometimes that ministers don't write newspaper editorials. Ministers, by and large, ought to be the regulator's best friend and vice versa. But partnership working, when problems are inherently difficult and complex, is sometimes frowned upon by regulators as undermining true independence. I don't think it need be, though of course that may depend on the minister and the government. Sometimes independent regulators feel they have no job advocating for their policy decisions and see the role of their press office and communications team as purely providers of information, unsullied by any attempt to explain in words that a journalist on a deadline might understand. That is a profound mistake. Independent regulators need to talk to politicians to find out how best to protect their independence. And this is vital because the anti-regulator brigade is, I fear, zealously on the march in parts of the government and the media. Some of them want to tie their anti-Brussels rhetoric with anti-regulator rhetoric, as they see them both as forces that restrict their ability to do what they want when they want to do it. But as a liberal, I see the case for independent regulation and for our membership of the EU as based on the same philosophical insight, that a society is better run when political power is more dispersed, checked, and limited. A world where elected politicians of the moment can have it all their own way and take irrational decisions not based on evidence or the long-term public good is not a world that I want to live in. So politicians should learn to treasure and nurture independent regulators, however frustrating they can be. Thank you.